Welcome to today's edition of 3-Minute Halacha as we continue to study the Melachav Kotev of writing. Rav Moshe Feinstein, in his fourth volume of Igrot Moshe, his responsa, on the section of Orach Chaim, the 40th tshuva responsa, the 10th paragraph, notes that any action that leads to something that is similar to writing is prohibited because of the melacha of kotev, but it's prohibited on a d'Rabbanan level, on a rabbinic level. This, he explains, is the reason why photography is prohibited on Shabbat. It creates an image, of course, in a very different fashion than you would normally do with drawing or writing, but it's still prohibited on Shabbat. This, too, would prohibit using a rubber stamp to create an image or to stamp a name onto something on Shabbat. It's very different than the traditional pen and paper, but the end result is that something has been written. However, what about a case where you really don't want to write anything, and yet something gets written? This is a very practical consideration. If a person is walking, for example, on sand or in the snow, and there is either a pattern or there is some manufacturer's label with a name that is at the bottom of their shoe, and every time they walk, it's a rubber stamp that puts that image into the snow or into the sand. Is that permitted on Shabbat or not? To understand the halacha, we need to have a number of different principles help us in this decision. The first is that what you are doing is something called a psikresha de lo nichale. It's an inevitable action that you really don't want. And so, for example, when you open a refrigerator door, you don't want the light to go on Shabbat, but you know that every time you open it, the light will turn on, and therefore you can't open the door. It's an inevitable action. However, an inevitable action is still a lower level prohibition because the melacha of Shabbat, the prohibitions of all the melachot, on a biblical level, need to be with intent, melechet machshevet. So we're at a lower level prohibition to begin with, the psikresha. When the action is only forbidden because of two different rabbinic possibilities, then a psikresha could be permitted on Shabbat. In this case, it's not a permanent kind of writing. It's not a katav shemitkayem that is going to be there long term. It's just an impression in snow or sand that'll go away. And secondly, it's not a normal way of writing in the sense that it's kila acher yad, literally. It's like with the back of a hand, or in this case, with your foot. So because of those two d'Rabbanans that are associated with this psikresha, and especially because it's a psikresha de lo nichale, something you really derive no benefit from, the fact that there's an impression in the sand or the snow, the Sharat Tziyun, the Chofetz Chaim, and Siman Shin Tet Zayin 316 in Orach Chaim, Siv Katan Yud Chet, explains that it's permitted. Of course, this is probably something that you imagine would be permitted. And in fact, the Taz on Siman Shin Chaf on 320 actually notes that when it's a psikresha, and there is even one other rabbinic issue associated with it, if it's something that's hard to avoid, there's room to rely and to permit it as well. So the bottom line is, using a stamp to create an image or letters on Shabbat are prohibited. Doing so, though, when you're walking in the snow or the sand with the bottom of your shoe is permitted, whether because it's a psikresha with two d'Rabbanans, two rabbinic prohibitions, or it's a psikresha that you just can't avoid. You have to walk, and there is still one other rabbinic prohibition or only rabbinic prohibition to allow it to be permitted.